In this lecture, we will go over the parts of the brain, very brief review of the various parts that I believe would be helpful in your practice than just loading you with information about every part of the brain that may not have much of a use for you. Okay, so given that, let's begin with the definitions of gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is the collection of cell bodies and the dendrites, and they appear somewhat gray or dull because they do not have that myelin coat. Axons do. And the places where you have concentrations of axons is referred to as white matter. The brain is where you have the main part, the cerebrum, that is shown here. Okay. In here, you see the surface being gray matter. Okay. This portion here is all gray matter. Okay. The deeper part is white matter. Okay. And now let's begin the organization of the brain. The cerebrum is where we start off with, the largest part of the brain and the most interior part, and takes up most of the space in the cranium, organized into two hemispheres, right and left, and now also organized into cortex and medulla, cerebral cortex, cerebral medulla. Cerebral cortex, therefore, is all gray matter. Cerebral medulla is all white matter. So you need to know that all of the cell bodies and the processing occurs within the cortex. And then the communication through tracks will all be in the deeper medulla. Okay, with that, we will look at this view here, pretty much the anterior lateral and the anterior view. You're looking at the two hemispheres, right and left. You have the gyri, the sulci, a longitudinal fissure. Here is the brainstem. Well, it's the midbrain, brainstem, this whole area here. You see the cerebellum, and then the continuation of the brainstem as the spinal cord. Okay, so here again in this view, you're looking at the cerebral hemisphere just on one side, the left side, and then the brainstem, only a small portion shown. Cerebellum, brainstem is this portion here. This is pons, to be exact. This is medulla, and this is the spinal cord. Okay, now let's focus just on the cerebral cortex, and it is color-coded for us to identify the four key parts of the cerebral cortex. One is the frontal cortex, and this color here is frontal lobe. Frontal lobe here. Here, this is parietal lobe, and this is the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. Okay, frontal lobe is supposedly dealing with the motor functions of the body. Then the parietal lobe is supposed to be mainly to deal with the somatosensory functions. You're talking about pain, pressure, touch, temperature, these kinds of sensations. Special senses are in the occipital lobe, in the temporal lobe. Taste, one of the special senses, is processed within the parietal lobe. We will organize the cerebral cortex and the four lobes even further in here. This is what we call as Brodmann's areas within the cerebral cortex. The basic organization into smaller segments. okay, by the scientist Brodmann, is what you're looking at. You're talking about 50 plus areas within this region. So we would not be talking about every little part, but only select a few parts to talk about. You're looking at primary visual cortex. That's where the sight, the photo reception is going to be processed. This pink area here. The darker area would be the association area, visual association area. That is where the information is gathered, only selected information is fed to this part that would then interpret the information. And now we are talking about the primary auditory cortex, that is where the sounds that we hear are processed. Okay, analysis, interpretation is all happening here related to sound. Now, similarly, we have some key areas within the parietal lobe and in the frontal lobe. So we are talking about primary motor cortex, this green band, an important one in terms of interpreting or processing and then allowing the motor functions to occur. So this is where the decisions to move one or another part will happen. In other words, it controls the motor units within the body, okay, throughout the body. So now this is a primary motor cortex, also called as precentral gyrus. Anatomically, it's the gyrus part in front of the sulcus that you see as this line here. But physiologically, this is a primary motor cortex, meaning this is where the initiation of signals for movement will occur. Now, an area close to that is the motor association area. Yet another important area here, this entire thing is called prefrontal cortex. That is the one that is referred to as the seat of intelligence, analysis, and controlling other cortical regions and receiving inputs from these regions. All of that is handled by prefrontal cortex. You do see Broca's area and Wernicke's area. These are the speech areas. Wernicke's area is where the actual sounds that you want to produce are originating. In other words, the message I want to convey to you is created here. And this is the part of the frontal lobe that would control the motor structures that are associated with speech, like the vocal cord, the pharyngeal, laryngeal muscles that are involved in speech, including the tongue muscles, okay? So anyway, now you basically looked at all of the key areas. We really do not want to look at every Brodmann's area that is in here. All right, so basically the same thing is shown in a simplified manner. You're looking at the language area. Broca is in the Wernicke's, and then you're talking about primary motor cortex and the I may not have mentioned to you about this band here, this pink one. So if you were to go back here, this blue area is what we call as the primary somatosensory area, primary somatosensory cortex, because it's the cortical region. And this is also the region that you would refer to as postcentral gyrus. Postcentral gyrus is part of a parietal lobe, and this is where the interpretation of the somatic senses will occur. Okay, so we will be looking at the expanded postcentral gyrus or precentral gyrus and how it's mapped within the brain. That would be an interesting topic to discuss later. Okay, So same thing here, primary visual cortex, and then the auditory cortex, the somatosensory cortex, and then the primary motor area. Okay, here is our mapping of the primary motor cortex. What you see here is graded motor units in a certain part of the body, graded area that would be allocated to that particular part. Because your hand is mobile, more mobile compared to the trunk. So realistically, the trunk is much more bigger, many times more bigger than the hand, but then the hand would receive a greater space here in the motor cortex. Similarly, lips and the tongue are all occupying a much greater region here compared to some other parts like the leg, the trunk, and so on. So that's interesting. More movable a part is, more space that's allocated here. And another important thing for you to know that I know here is that the right side of the body is all processed on the left part of the cerebral cortex, the left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, this is our sensory homunculus. Very similar idea. Here you're talking about sensory receptors that are present in a particular part of the body. Okay, fingertips and the tongue and the lips, and then the eyeball and roof of the nasal cavity where you have olfactory receptors. All those would occupy a greater amount of the postcentral gyrus or primary somatosensory cortex than the larger parts of the body with fewer sensory receptors. Again, the sensory signals are processed in the opposite side of the body. The left cerebral hemisphere handles the sensory signals from the right side of the body and vice versa. Basal nuclei are a set of cell bodies, or nuclei that you find within the very base of the cerebrum. So we are now done with the cerebral cortex and the medulla. We are in the floor of the cerebrum where you see a number of different nuclei. They have individual names and you do not have to memorize those or anything, but note that these nuclei do have motor control. Okay, so those are the set of nuclei in the base of the cerebrum. Now, in the next slide, we'll talk about the specific role they play, inhibitory role in motor control. Okay, so what do they do? Inhibit muscle tone. Then again, select and maintain purposeful motor activity. Okay, then suppression of useless or unwanted patterns of movement. So these are the types of movements. You really cannot pinpoint the place where they would be involved. It's more of a global regulation of movement. Help monitor and coordinate slow and sustained contractions, especially those related to posture and support. Okay, so basal nuclei, motor control is how you would connect those two. Next one is about limbic system. It's basically a set of structures in a nearby location between the cerebral hemispheres and the diencephalon. You have the amygdala, you have hippocampus, you have hypothalamus, thalamus, the cerebral cortex. All of those form a ring-like arrangement. And that is what you refer to as the limbic system. Limbic system is supposed to be the one to deal with emotion. Okay, so it's the emotional center. Because it involves so many different structures, some are evolutionarily new and some are old, the links between these parts is not so strong or well developed, and that's where humans have less control over emotions still. Now, please switch our attention to the diencephalon, which is made of three distinct parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then the epithalamus. Epithalamus is dominated by one gland. This is pineal gland that makes melatonin, that puts you to sleep. Besides that, we do not have much to say about epithalamus. Thalamus is an important one. This is the one that receives these sensory pathways. When we talk about sensory pathways, we will look at thalamus specifically. What happens is, if you're looking at the sensory pathway that's arriving from the peripheral area, say the fingertip, and then through the spinal cord, through the brain stem, and then land in the thalamus. And then the thalamus would diffuse this signal, the sensory information, further up into the cerebral cortex through another set of neurons. So that's where thalamus gets the name relay center. It relays sensory information. Almost all of the sensory signals across the thalamus except olfaction. Olfaction takes a different path entirely. Remember that it begins in the olfactory epithelium that's in the roof of the nasal cavity, and then olfactory nerves. Those are cranial nerves, number one. And then they reach the olfactory, they become olfactory tracts, and that is how they're processed in the olfactory area within the cerebral cortex. So that's the exception. All other sensory signals do cross the thalamus. The last but not the least is the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus has many important roles in the body, both neural and endocrine. So it gets the name neuroendocrine structure. Okay, it has the centers, vital centers, probably regulation of autonomic nervous system, and sleep center, temperature regulation, and the production of hormones, and appetite center, memory, part of the limbic system. So it goes on and on and on. So we will discuss some of the roles where it's specifically involved. Okay, so important structure, we will talk about it on and off in many places. Now, the brainstem. Brainstem is made of these three important structures: midbrain, pons, and medulla. Okay, midbrain is where you would see two cranial nerves originate, cranial nerve 3 and 4. Both are motor cranial nerves controlling the eye movement. And midbrain is where you have some key structures like substantia nigra, red nucleus. You would say that midbrain is associated with motor control via the becoming the place for some motor pathways: rubrospinal pathway, reticulospinal pathway, etc. And Parkinson's disease is connected with substantia nigra. Substantia nigra is the one that contains dopaminergic neurons. Damage to these neurons is supposed to result in Parkinson's disease. So that is how midbrain is studied. Mostly also. Another important feature of the midbrain is the presence of reticular activating system. Reticular activating system spreads over this entire brainstem. So part of it is in the midbrain. Reticular activating system for you is an important structure. Why? Because that's the one that makes us be awake. And some of the agents that you use may make this region numb, and then you lose consciousness because this area is affected from the agents that are used. So reticular activating system is going to be discussed later, but for now that is midbrain, and the portion of the ventricle that you see in the midbrain is called cerebral aqueduct or a mesencephalic aqueduct. Basically, aqueduct is the way you would recognize the cavity in here. Next, the pons. Pons is also simply called as the bridge. It bridges many structures. One, it bridges the midbrain and the medulla, and then the cerebellum on either side. Okay, so pons is where you would find 4 more cranial nerves. Those are 5, 6, 7, 8. Cranial nerve 5, trigeminal, is both sensory and motor. Cranial nerve 6, abducens, is again dealing with eye movement, supplies the extrinsic eye muscles. 7 is facial, deals with taste, sensation, and it has both motor and sensory and motor functions. Sensory function is to deal with sensation from the face. That's the reason why it's called facial, and dealing with motor control of the facial muscles as well. So it gives facial expression, for example. Okay, so those are some functions. 8 is a pure sensory nerve. Cranial nerve 8 is vestibulocochlear. This originates from the inner ear, brings both sensory signals about hearing and then also balance. The balance part is taken to the spinal cord, cerebellum, where they learn about the body position and adjust those accordingly, and then the hearing is processed in the auditory cortex. Now, the last part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata, a very important region because it has centers like the breathing center. Oh, by the way, pons also has the breathing center. Actually, breathing centers are spread between the pons and the medulla. You have a pneumotaxic center, apneustic center. Those are in the pons, and then the dorsal respiratory group and ventral respiratory group are in the medulla. Those 4 centers are needed in the regulation of breathing. Okay, so now let's focus on the other functions of the medulla. Besides having these respiratory centers, it has the cardiovascular center, or sometimes you call it as cardiac center and vasomotor center. Either way, the heart rate and the vasoconstriction, vasodilation, all of those are regulated from this part of the brain. Okay, so if you're talking about parasympathetic supply, that involves cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. All those are from the brainstem area. 9, 10, 11, 12 come from the medulla. 9 is glossopharyngeal, that again deals with the sensation of taste, and it also has motor function that deals with the pharyngeal muscle movement and some other muscles locally as well. And then 10 is vagus nerve, very important, has both sensory and motor functions. And this is the one that brings sensory signals from visceral organs. Remember that sensory signals from the visceral organs are not well located, diffuse type of signals, but it also carries the motor signals back to them. Okay, stretch could be detected by vagus nerve, and then the peristalsis could be controlled by vagus nerve, so both sensory motor functions. So it could be found in the bronchi and the heart and the lungs, and then the stomach and the intestines and so on. So it's wide spread around many visceral organs in the body. Okay, 11 and 12 are both motor, and they supply muscles locally. 11 is a spinal accessory because part of it is shared by the spinal cord. Okay, so with that, we will look at reticular activating system more closely, abbreviated as RAS, or another name for it is reticular formation. As I mentioned before, the system is stretched over the entire brain stem, and the way it works is sensory signals as they go through the brain stem, they are dispersed into different parts of the cerebral cortex from the thalamus here, but they do go through the brainstem, correct? And that is where the reticular activating system has a hold on whether to move these signals forward or to hold them back in here. So when you're sleeping, not all signals are carried to the thalamus. Some of them are blocked off right here. Why? There are chemicals secreted locally here. Think about norepinephrine and other neurotransmitters. That norepinephrine would serve as an inhibiting neurotransmitter here, block off the signals from reaching higher centers. Okay, so that is how you would turn off signals and then not reach the cerebral cortex. So no need to process these signals. That's when the brain assumes a new situation that we fall asleep. Okay, so the neurotransmitter levels vary in a diurnal pattern, meaning the levels would be less during daytime, greater during nighttime. And that is how you have the awake time of morning when you're fresh, and sleep when you're, when the signals are blocked off. Okay, so responsible for the alert state is how you call it. General anesthetics, what do? Depress the reticular activating system. That's how you think you would be sedating the patient. Now, the cerebellum, this would be the last structure to discuss in here among the brain parts. Spinal cord will be another lecture. Cerebellum is the second large structure within the brain. The anatomy somewhat is like that of cerebrum, meaning cortex, medulla, cortex is the gray matter, medulla is the white matter kind of arrangement, okay? Here you have a unique type of neurons. Their cell bodies are with dendrites that are extensively branched, and they are called Purkinje fibers. They give this appearance that resembles the arbor tree, arbor vitae, that's like a pine tree. So that is the appearance here. Now let's get to the function. Function is where we go here. We basically want to say that important in a balance and muscle tone is regulated, okay? A fine-tuning of movements, planning and executing skilled voluntary movement. So the rough movement is initiated by the primary motor cortex, and that is all made more elegant, more sophisticated by the role of the cerebellum. Okay, a muscle tone is regulated by the cerebellum, and then muscle tone is needed to assume posture, and then what else? A smooth, precise, directed movement. We have talked about that, and prevents overreaching. Basically, what that's saying is, if you wanna grab a pen, how far you have to stretch is controlled by the cerebellum. You don't place your hand way far or way short, but exactly at where the pen is. So that is the kind of a precise regulation of movement is what we're talking about. Any injury to cerebellum would make a person lose balance and things related to that kind of function. And a person with motor skill, like playing the piano or robotics or gymnastics, that kind of stuff, they would have a well-developed cerebellum. Their motor units will be much more well-developed than that of a person who would not be skilled in those things.